So first up, Christians and the state. Should we obey them, especially in COVID-19 times? Now, people seem to be all at sea, understanding whether or not we should, and then in what particular circumstances we shouldn't, and so on. Conceptually, it's very simple, and people don't always like my answer. I'm dealing with it because it's come up several times on this tour, especially in the Q&A. But in every scenario, you will find that you have up to 3 options. 1, obey God and government. Happiness. Or 2, obey God, but not government. It's trouble. Or 3, obey government, but not God. Never, ever do that. The biblical instruction is actually very clear, and it is that we must obey option 1 or pursue option 1 by every means possible, in every situation possible, to obey God and government. And in the rare circumstance that that is not possible, and it happens from time to time. For example, in Victoria, they recently passed a change in suppression bill, and I said, live as though the bill doesn't exist. Why? Because it asks you to do things which you cannot, in good conscience before God, actually do. For example, it says, if somebody comes up to you and says, pray for me in my whatever LGBT status they have, you're not supposed to do it. It's legally fraught. You should do it. And so option 2 is the option that you pursue when you cannot pursue option 1, obedience to both. But you should never pursue option 3 under any circumstances whatsoever, which is obedience to government, but not to God. Now, this does mean, and I don't like my own conclusion on this, I want to be very clear, because it does mean that we will find ourselves obeying disagreeable laws. We will find ourselves submitting to maybe very disagreeable laws, perhaps even laws that we think are unfair, perhaps even laws from governments that we think are incompetent and incapable and not good governments. But we must, provided we do not break God's commands. It will also mean that you find yourself accommodating and adapting to laws that you don't like, finding a way to obey God and government. Now, in a democracy, you can speak out against such laws. In a democracy, you can advocate, perhaps vehemently and fiercely, against such laws. And that's sort of why ACL exists, right? Because we have a gift, we have a freedom. We can speak, we can act. That's not the same as breaking those laws. Now, here are the objections that I've heard. Person number 1 says, and this has actually been said to me, but the government is not fulfilling its duty. It's a bad government. Why do I have to obey a bad government? And the answer is simple. No Christian duty is dependent on the performance of the other party. Christians actually live out of a posture of duty, not rights. We don't claim for ourselves, we give. That's why Jesus said, what are the 2 greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Where are the rights? There are none. God has all the rights. And God says to you, you have a duty to God to love God, and a duty to God to love your neighbor. And all Christian duties are just that. They don't depend on the other person. They don't depend on the satisfaction of your rights. It doesn't matter whether it says children obey your parents. You say, what if I have imperfect parents? Doesn't matter. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. What if they're disobedient? Doesn't matter. Servants, obey your masters. What if they're bad masters? What if they're bad bosses? Peter specifically addresses that. He says, doesn't matter. In fact, by your good behavior under such circumstances, be a witness to them, he says. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. What if they're working against you? Doesn't matter. And vice versa. Wives, submit to your husbands. What if they're not leading as they should? Doesn't matter. Christian duties are just that. They're not rights. They don't depend on the performance of the other party. And so, yes, if a government is imperfect, we still have to obey it. For the Lord's sake, it actually says in Peter. Person number 2 says, but surely you can disobey. This is someone said this to me. They said, surely if the interests of your neighbour are at stake, you can disobey the government in order to serve their interests, because bad governments are bad for your neighbour. I said, well, it's quite contorted, really. But that's a little bit like saying I'm going to break this commandment of God to fulfill that commandment of God. It doesn't work that way. That's actually one of the temptations that Jesus had in the wilderness from the devil, when he said, if you throw yourself off of here, you know there's a promise that God will not let you be hurt. His angels will have charge concerning you. And Jesus says, yeah, but it says you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. I can't break one to claim the other. That's not how it works. Or here's a cracker. Person number 3 says, yeah, but if that's true, that would mean that Christians would become generally submissive to a totalitarian government. Sure, the answer to that question is yes, they would. Yes, they would. We've been there before, many times, and that is precisely how it plays out. I was reading a letter the other day that was written by a guy called Pliny the Younger. He was the governor of Bithynia in 110 AD. And he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan, and he was perplexing himself because he was sitting there executing Christians, quite a large number of them. They would come and stand before him, and this is an incredible thing, but they'd stand before him and he'd say to them, are you a Christian? You've been reported as a Christian. And they'd say, yes, I am. And say, I need to let you know that being a Christian is a capital offense. I'm going to ask you again, are you a Christian? And they might say, yes, I am. And then he'd say, I'm going to give you one more chance. It's a capital offense and you'll be executed. Are you a Christian? And if they said yes, he said, all right, you're being executed. They got carried away and executed. But Pliny, his conscience might have been getting to him perhaps, because he was sitting there saying in his letter, but these people are law-abiding citizens. These people pray for the emperor. These people never disobey my edicts and my commands and my laws. They are good, upstanding, decent citizens, and you're telling me to execute them. That was what was going on in his conscience. In other words, they were living out the words of the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 4:15, which says, make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a troublesome meddler. Don't suffer as a lawbreaker in the eyes of your community. But he says, if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in that name. That was the difference with these early Christians. They were suffering as Christians. It was actually a crime to be a Christian. But they were not suffering as lawbreakers to the extent that they could help it. To the extent that they could help it. You say, but what does this mean? Well, do you know, we need not fear because the Church of Jesus Christ has been under such conditions before, and that never thwarts God's plan. It's interesting to me, whilst as Christians, there's a tension here. We have a voice to politics. In democracy, we have a remarkable freedom to stand up for righteousness and speak truth and be salt and light. We need to do all of those things. But here's the other interesting thing. God still works even when the government isn't perfect. God still works even when the government turns actively bad. We will do all that we can, but God has still got the outcome, even when it doesn't go the way we wish it would. It says in Daniel 4:35, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are of no account, but he does according to his will among the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can fend off his hand or say to him, what have you done? His kingdom is forever. His kingdom operates with or without the power structures of this world. We are simply called to acknowledge the reality that he is king. And even when men won't do that, he still is king, and his purposes still come to pass. There's a number of scriptures that would cement what I have said. There is the obvious one, Romans 13, 1-2. I actually got criticised the other day. Somebody said to me, oh, you're just one of those Romans 13 Christians. And I thought, well yeah, I guess I am. You know, it is in the Bible, you know. I am definitely a Romans 13 Christian because Romans 13 is scripture. And it says every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those which exist have been established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. Pretty clear, right? But it's backed up in 1 Peter 2. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to the king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. And it goes on to say effectively in 1 Peter 4, what I read before, which is, look, if you are going to suffer, make sure for the sake of your Christian testimony, it's for doing the right thing, not for breaking the law unnecessarily. And that's kind of the situation I think we're entering a little bit. You don't want the church to suffer for breaking the law unnecessarily. You want us to suffer only for those things that we can stand on and declare this was God's will. We had no choice. And of course, that's the witness of the apostles in Acts chapter 5, where they get told to stop speaking in the name of Jesus Christ. They have no choice. They say we must obey God rather than men. We can't do that. And they face the consequences and they pray for boldness to continue. Or indeed, in the case of Daniel, and this is an unbelievable one, I think what a guy was Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, when Darius passes a law that says you can pray to nobody but Darius. And it says when Daniel knew that the edict had been signed. It says he went and did as he had done previously. And he knelt in his upper chamber and he prayed 3 times a day. Do you know, Daniel knew what the penalty was, fed to the lions. It wasn't like a $100 fine, maybe a year in jail. Fed to the lions. I mean, what a guy. Because he said, well, I'm never going to get into the situation of option 3, obey government and not God. We must never do that.